Imagine for a moment that you're in the middle of an epidemic. You have reports of people falling ill and dying in your community, your country, and around the world. You don't have a solution, but you think you see the outlines of the cause. You feel a constant anxiety, sometimes in the background, sometimes right at the surface, that something is wrong, but we can fix it, and no one seems to care. Well, not no one. One man seems to be on the same page. He has been sounding the alarm for decades, and after years of being silenced and marginalized, he's finally in a position to do something about it. This is how fans of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. feel about him and about Maha, short for Make America Healthy Again. RFK spent decades as an environmental lawyer and wellness influencer, and now Trump has nominated him to be the head of the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, his fans think, things will change. Getting a clear definition of Maha is tricky, because it's not a policy statement or a manifesto. It's an attempt to rebrand and clarify a mixed stew of messages that Kennedy has been putting out as a wellness influencer for years, and now figuring out the specific actions and policies that he'll take in government. He has fought over hundreds of issues over the years, but you can boil down his brand to 3 pillar messages. The first is purity, that the artificial, synthetic, and unnatural secretly poison our health in the form of toxic dyes, preservatives, and other additives in our food and in our vaccines, and that we need to cleanse these to heal. Then there's what I'll call spirit. Kennedy imagines a moral dimension to every moment. Poor health reflects a poisoned spirit, and a grounded spirit restores a broken body. And although God features prominently in his talks, the real recurring link seems to be nature. Natural foods, natural immunity, exercise, and sunshine are his solutions to almost all of our problems. And then there's corruption. Kennedy sells himself as anti-big. Big food, big pharma, and big agriculture. In his mind, these groups have corrupted government through lobbying so they can sell food and drugs with the intent of making us sick, using biased science and faulty policy. And he believes that they suppress any wellness practice or technology like drinking raw milk or taking supplements that they can't profit from. These aren't hard lines. They overlap and intersect, sometimes in odd ways. But in combination with his personal bent for exaggeration and conspiracy, they've led him to make wild claims. So the conversation about Maha tends to devolve into 2 positions. The first is that RFK Jr. is an anti-vax, anti-intellectual, pseudo-scientific, grifter-allied liar. His past statements disqualify him, and even if some proposals sound sane, he has shown he can't be trusted to run something as important as the HHS. The other side thinks that, sure, RFK Jr. is flawed, yeah, but he's a hero outsider who can break a consensus that isn't working and inspire national interest in fixing our mounting chronic health crisis. Even worse is the middle ground commentary, which tends to completely ignore his worst statements or summarize them as controversial and polarizing, without getting into details so that they can end on a semi-optimistic, well, he's different, so maybe he can fix things. Whichever angle you take, it stonewalls the conversation, because in the end it comes down to RFK Jr., the man. Do you think he's a good guy or a bad guy? Charismatic and compelling, or a crank and a pathological liar? But now that he might hold the reins of the Department of Health and Human Services, overseeing more than 80,000 employees, a budget of $1.8 trillion, and policies that affect the health and livelihoods of every American and many people around the world, I'm more interested in what's next. What can RFK Jr. actually do with Maha? And what can we expect from the next 4 years if he's appointed? And the more you dig into those details, the more you realize that even if you like RFK Jr., even if you think he has great ideas that can change Americans' health for the better, Maha is set up to fail you. To understand why, and to fill in some gaps, we need a little bit of history on Bobby and how he got here. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was born January 17, 1954. As a Kennedy, for worse or for worse, he was born and raised with the pressure and expectation of leadership. As a youth, he was a troublemaker, which might not have been an issue if things had gone all right.
Dear viewer, things did not go all right.
John F. Kennedy, Bobby's uncle, became president when RFK Jr. was 7 years and 3 days old. JFK was the youngest man elected to the White House, charismatic, and had a passion for public health. He emphasized the importance of physical vigor in the fight against communism. More than just health, though, he wanted fitness, vibrancy, a competitive American spirit. He promoted universal, high-skilled, standards-based fitness programs in public schools. And he did this by using his star power to draw attention and resources to programs that were successful at the time, like the La Sierra High School program. He energized the President's Council and directed it towards fitness not just for youth, but all Americans, even going so far as to create the American exercise routine. And he tried to inspire the public with challenges like the Kennedy March. The Kennedy March, it's almost emblematic of JFK's impact on public fitness. It started when JFK learned of an executive order from Teddy Roosevelt that Marines should be able to march 50 miles over 20 hours. He issued it as a challenge to his White House staff, and his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was serving as Attorney General, took him up on it. But it became an American challenge. It wasn't policy. It wasn't even smart. His own President's Council tried to cool people on trying it because making your first workout a 50-mile walk is probably not a great idea. But it was inspirational, and tens of thousands of people, soldiers, citizens, even people from other countries, took up the call to try the Kennedy March.
So, I'm doing it. As it turns out, this the one day I have is the one day when San Diego decides to rain. So this is going to be a exciting little journey. But yeah, I found a trail that could be made out into 12.5 miles. And so that's down and back twice. So 2 laps to make up the Kennedy March. So I'm at mile 5, and it's still raining a bit, so I'm taking a break under this bridge to record this section just to protect the camera. So despite his flaws, JFK had vigor, he had charisma, he modeled the type of fitness he wanted to see out of America, and he was starting to make a change. And then November 22nd, 1963, JFK was assassinated when RFK Jr. was just 9 years old. And 5 years later, his father, Robert Kennedy Sr., was also assassinated. And things went as you might expect for a problem child in a high-profile family dealing with trauma and grief. Not well. According to RFK Jr., he started doing heroin at age 15, and at age 28, he tried to become a lawyer, but failed to pass the bar exam and then was convicted of heroin possession. He eventually recovered, got sober, went into AA, and started a decades-long career as an environmental lawyer, mostly focusing on prosecuting polluting industries, fossil fuels being the biggest one. And this narrative of recovery, of degeneracy and corruption, pulling himself up through faith and family to change himself and potentially change the world, has been a running part of RFK Jr.'s narrative. But that recovery isn't necessarily complete. So a lot of his peers at the time, and according to a journal submitted to the New York Post, RFK Jr. continued cheating on his wife, was wildly unprofessional, and allegedly committed sexual assault against a nanny who was working for the family at the time. Now, as to his response to that allegation, it was a non-response.
Listen, I've said this from the beginning. I am not a church boy. I am not running like that. I said I had a very, very rambunctious youth. I am who I am.
You're talking there about the nanny situation. I mean, I do have to ask her. I mean, are you denying it or not?
I'm not going to comment on it.
All right.
In the late 90s, early 2000s, RFK Jr. took up the anti-vaccine cause as his personal vendetta, seeming to conflate the mercury contamination in America's waterways that he was fighting professionally with a different type of mercury that was used in some vaccines as a preservative, and the ideas kind of spun off from there. In 2014, he left his position with the National Resources Defense Council as a lawyer, presumably and based on interviews with some of his peers at the time because of his growing anti-science views. In 2015, he started work with the World Mercury Project, rebranding it to Children's Health Defense in 2016, an organization that took on broader issues like fluoridation and 5G contamination, and of course, anti-vaccines. In 2019, RFK infamously got involved trying to discourage vaccine uptake in Samoa in the middle of a measles outbreak that killed a lot of Samoan children. Now, this should have been damaging to his career, to his reputation, but it kind of positioned him to be an anti-vax medical freedom influencer when COVID hit. And whether he was wrong on any of these specific issues, it paid off. In 2018, Children's Health Defense saw $1.1 million in revenue. By 2020, $6.8 million. $15 million in 2021, and $23.5 million in 2022. And that's where Maha begins.
On April 19th, 2023, RFK Jr. announced a campaign for the presidency as a Democrat. This was a choice. After a surprisingly strong Democrat performance in the 2022 midterm elections, President Joe Biden committed to run, and he had the backing of the party. The primaries were effectively locked. Two other candidates, Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips, they also ran and were also rans. Their campaign fizzled out quickly. Recognizing that the gates were shut, RFK switched in October to running as an independent and officially started playing the third-party game. For non-Americans in the audience, this was a commitment to lose. No third party has won the presidency since the birth of the current two parties in 1856. The closest anyone ever got was Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, and he was an already successful and popular former president. And he got less than 30% of the vote. So why even run? Well, third-party presidential candidates and the C-tier candidates from the party primaries are in it for other reasons. Some want to advance awareness for a cause or advance their personal brand, since just being a candidate means that you'll at least get some news coverage. If you poll well, collect attention, more people will donate to your campaign and to your cause, and they'll vote for you in protest because they also care about your cause. Others want to set up a future political career. The campaign is like a practice run. It helps make them connections and sets them up for future campaigns. And the most ambitious are looking to secure a position from the winner as a reward for getting out of the race. These spoilers pull votes away from other candidates. And in a close race, that could mean the difference between winning and losing. It's why they pretend so hard to be in it to win, even when they know they're not. Their followers' votes are the bargaining chip that they hope to cash in with the winner.
So let's bring this back to RFK. While Biden was still in the election, RFK Jr. was polling pretty well, about 10% with an even split from voters that would otherwise vote for each of the other two parties. His environmental chops, his relative youth, and his family history were appealing to otherwise Democrats who were put off by Biden. And his wellness chops, his relative youth, and his familiarity in the podcast bro space appealed to otherwise Republicans put off by Trump. And with the election still a long way off and the stakes low, a lot of voters were willing to admit to a poll or to themselves that they would take a risk on a third-party candidate. And all of that deflated when Biden dropped out of the race in favor of his vice president, Kamala Harris. Almost immediately, RFK Jr.'s polling numbers cut in half. The otherwise Democrats might not have liked Harris, but they saw her as better than the alternative, which might have actually improved RFK's position, because now he was strongest against one candidate in particular, so he could spoil in both directions. Stay in the race, pull votes from Trump. Leave the race, votes go back to Trump. So his campaign reached out to both candidates. He was clearly in contact with Trump's campaign by July at the latest, based on some reporting and this leaked phone call between him and Trump.
Too many times, and then you hear that it doesn't have an impact, right? But you and I talked about that a long time ago. And anyway, I would love you to do so, and I think it'll be so good for you and so big for you.
And his campaign reached out to Harris's campaign in August, but she couldn't accept him. His conspiratorial views and anti-science brand were toxic to hers. So they rejected him and Trump accepted him. On August 23rd, RFK Jr. suspended his run for president and endorsed Trump. On November 5th, Trump won the election, and 10 days later, November 15th, Trump nominated RFK Jr. as the Secretary for the Department of Health and Human Services. And as of recording, that's where we stand. His nomination hasn't been confirmed, but it's likely. So we have to ask, given this power, given that RFK is no longer an influencer or a CEO, but a potential leader in health and in human services, what can RFK Jr. do? And what will he do? Ugh, damn it. Got all wet.
RFK has said that he wants to transform our nation's entire approach to health, throwing out all sorts of ideas that we'll cover later. But just because RFK is head of the HHS doesn't mean he'll actually get to do what he wants. In order to keep his position and to turn his agenda into reality, he has to balance a tangle of competing priorities. He has to meet the interests of his key supporters, the people who helped put him in power, and that he'll need if he wants to stay in power. This includes individual influencers and connectors within his political network, and the voters whose support gave him the political clout that he needed to bargain for his position. Then he has the party. Many of the things that he wants that are related to health don't belong to the HHS. They belong to the IRS or the USDA, other departments with their own objectives. So he'll have to play within or fight against the Republican Party and key players in Trump's administration. He has to appeal to Trump, who nominated him and can fire him without cause. And of course, RFK has his own beliefs and objectives, the things he personally thinks will be good for America's health, the legacy he wants to be remembered for. When we understand what these figures want, we get a better picture for what Maha can actually do, and helps us better understand the real goals behind what is stated as policy. First, let's look at his personal allies, starting with the Means. Casey and Callie Means are a brother-sister influencer duo with close connections to RFK Jr. Casey is a doctor who quit her clinical residency and now positions herself as a rogue, enlightened doctor who saw the health industry from the inside and wants to change it. She runs a company called Levels, which sells continuous glucose monitors for non-medical use. Casey would benefit from RFK Jr.'s control of the HHS because the science hasn't been on her side. Large, high-quality studies haven't shown that glucose monitoring is useful for non-diabetics. And it would be great if the science and maybe some insurance providers could budge a little bit on that one. Casey's brother Callie is a lobbyist turned health influencer who positions himself as a rogue, enlightened marketer who saw the food industry from the inside and wants to change it. He runs the company TrueMed. TrueMed partners with retailers that offer luxury wellness products, supplements, cold plunges, hair growth caps, and of course, his sister's continuous glucose monitors. Doctors working for TrueMed offer letters of medical necessity so that you can pay for these items out of health savings accounts or flexible savings accounts. These accounts are tax sheltered, so you're effectively getting a 22 to 37% discount. The wealthier you are, the more you save. The business model is actually very similar to companies that sell Viagra over the internet. You have a consumer who just wants to buy something, and so they need a doctor to kind of bless the transaction. Except in the case of those companies, the product that they're serving is a prescription drug, and there are concerns that a doctor needs to check with you and review your questionnaire before you purchase the thing. For TrueMed, you're just buying supplements and saunas, and these accounts, HSAs and FSAs, were legally designed to prevent people like Casey from doing exactly what he's doing. And not everyone can open them, there are annual limits to how much you can put into them, and the IRS has explicitly stated that even with a doctor's note, what TrueMed is offering does not qualify for tax-free spending. And without the HSA FSA bonus, TrueMed is an unnecessary middleman, so it would be really great for Cali if those rules were just a little bit. Then there's Dr. Mark Hyman. Mark and RFK Jr. have a long history together, from backcountry trips to writing articles for the World Mercury Project. Mark has been the biggest voice in functional medicine, which involves taking batteries of tests to search for hidden issues like heavy metal toxicity and adrenal fatigue. Mark has been fighting for justification and legitimacy within the broader scientific community because most of his practices and recommendations don't hold up, and functional medicine as a whole is designed to maximize provider profits. You invent a fuzzy diagnosis, design a battery of tests that will inevitably find something out of whack, and then charge for the tests, the diagnosis, and the inevitable detox supplement stack. As Dr. David Gorski put it, reams of worthless labs and plans in one hand, and a huge invoice in the other. So it would be really great for Dr. Hyman if functional medicine was seen as more credible. And then there's Del Bigtree. Del has been a close ally of RFK Jr.'s, traveling and speaking with him during COVID, becoming his communications director during his campaign, and he now runs two fundraising operations, Maha Alliance and Maha Action. His aims are clear. He produced the film Vaxxed with the disgraced Dr. Andrew Wakefield and campaigned against vaccines during COVID. His most recent activism is through the Informed Consent Action Network, where he sues the government and pharmaceutical companies to pause vaccinations, drown them in legal paperwork, and most notably, try to revoke approval for the polio vaccine. His advocacy has led to exponential growth in donations to ICANN and to his personal wealth. For Del, it would be great if more potential donors saw him as connected to the halls of power, and if someone would slow or stop vaccines. Fans, the Maha Moms and Rogan Bros, among others, they say they want specific policies like ending the fluoridation of public water, but they're not going to vouch for tap water if fluoridation stops. Their lifestyles, their brands, center around uncommon purity and wellness practices. It makes them special. And they want respectability for their worldview and a validation of their grievances. In practice, for Maha Moms, this would mean things like ending mandatory vaccination for public schooling, both because they've been led to believe it will harm their kids, and because the mandates make them feel isolated. For some of them, it would just be a good feeling to have an ally in the top office. For others, RFK's presence provides an excuse to publicly support Donald Trump, who would otherwise be damaging to their brands. And there are plenty of others. It can be hard from the outside to untangle the network of those who are core to the operation and those who just associate themselves for clout. But this provides an idea of the kind of personal and ideological motivations that he has to deliver for his allies. But even if he's appointed, RFK Jr. won't own health. He'll be the head of the Department of Health and Human Services. Within the HHS, you see a wide range of services, including 3 in particular that RFK has focused on: the Center for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, and the National Institutes of Health. But because of how complex and diverse health is, if you want to take a holistic approach like RFK seems to, you can't just do it within the HHS. To change agriculture and food, he'll need the USDA. To change tax incentives and subsidies, he'll need the IRS. And so he'll need to do all of this within the Republican Party. So what do they want in terms of health? Well, if you read the 2024 Republican Party platform, nothing. I mean, you might argue that some of these points could indirectly relate to health. Oh, wait, there is one mention: securing Medicare. But that's it. And note also that they specify Medicare, which covers those 65 and older, and not Medicaid, which covers low-income Americans. And that makes sense. Maha was a Hail Mary play in a tight election to swing a small demographic to vote for Trump, not an authentic priority for the Republican Party, which seems to care a lot more about economics, military power, hating immigrants, hating progressives, and hating queer people. But we do get some insights from a document called Project 2025.
In brief, Project 2025 is a 900-plus page document written by the Heritage Foundation and backed by some of the most powerful players in the conservative movement. It's broken up into a number of chapters, each one outlining a different department of government and how the Heritage Foundation thinks it should be run. I think of it as the crypto-fascist playbook for America, because it tries to unite the 3 dominant special interests within the conservative movement today. Christian dominionists, who want their interpretation of divine law to take over American law and leadership. Wealthy techno-industrialists who want government support for their projects and businesses, but protection from those pesky regulations. And white nationalists, who want to halt immigration from non-white nations, exploit and oppress the black and brown people who are here right now, empower local authorities to resist federal anti-discrimination laws, for example, and generally just push back against everyone who's been fighting them and winning since Brown v. Board of Education. All 3 of these groups are fundamentally authoritarian. They think that terrible things will happen unless the right people have power, their people. And because of that, they share some common objectives, but they also have some serious differences and frictions. Some of that came to light early in 2025 in the fight over H-1B visas. Project 2025 tries to weld these competing interests under 3 themes: the unitary executive, selective deregulation, and America First. In plain English, this means you give the president and the executive branch in general as much power as humanly possible, whether constitutionally or not. Then you take that power and you give it to the businesses and allies who are going to keep you in power, ideally in their mind forever, and then you use that power to enforce an agenda that serves the interests of Americans by their definition of what makes a real American. During the campaign, Trump tried to distance himself from the project because it was, rightly, unpopular. His transition team co-chair, Howard Lutnick, vowed to blacklist anyone who was a contributor to the project from a major place within the administration. And Trump himself said he didn't know anything about it.
You said no, the lie detector test determined that was a lie.
Project 2025 was designed and backed by some of Trump's most powerful supporters and closest personal advisors. Many of its chapters were written by people in his administration, and vow or not, Trump has nominated or appointed many of its contributors to high places within his administration. Although the Trump team may not 100% agree with every word that's written in the project, there's clearly a lot of overlap, and many Republicans do.
So what does the project have to say about RFK's job? The chapter on Health and Human Services has nothing to say about RFK's primary issues. Not a single mention of obesity, chronic disease, and the word prevention is only used to highlight proper nouns. The chapter is instead focused on restricting access to abortion, hating on trans people, preserving religious and conscience exemptions, and restricting funding to any organization that doesn't comply with this agenda. There's a reference to research funding, what we'll get to later because Bobby borrows it, but besides that, they didn't mention anything in RFK's agenda, which, again, makes sense. Ideologically, they reject most of his ideas, and they are going to fight against it. The project does, however, have a lot of things to say on an adjacent department that RFK needs to make things happen. Chapter 10 of the project on the US Department of Agriculture, or USDA, couldn't get farther from RFK's vision. Bobby and the Children's Health Defense Fund have advocated against GMO crops for years. The project is staunchly pro-GMO, using the euphemism biotechnologies. It encourages pushing policy to remove obstacles to using more of them, repealing a federal mandate on labeling, and pressuring other countries to accept GMO crops from the US. Bobby wants to invest in organic food and regenerative agriculture. The project says that organic farming is too expensive, land-intensive, and that farmers know what they need to do without government meddling. Bobby thinks that natural conservation and protecting the environment from pollution is key to our national health. The project wants to cut programs that would do that by protecting key environmental areas from farming, programs that would ideally build natural resilience and protect habitats and waterways from runoff or other pollution. Bobby wants people to get healthier food through SNAP, WIC, and other support programs. The project wants fewer people to get access to these programs. Bobby wants to get more healthy food into kids' hands by reforming the National School Lunch Program and eliminating ultra-processed foods from that program. The project wants fewer kids to have access to school lunches. And what's fascinating is that the Democratic Party, both in the last term and in the 2024 campaign, was doing many of these things. Vice presidential candidate Tim Walz expanded free school breakfasts and lunches in his state, and the Biden administration expanded access to school lunches nationally. The Biden administration pushed to expand natural conservation programs, more sharply regulate GMOs, expand SNAP, and invest in organic farming. Something that the project actually criticizes him for. If RFK is your writer, he is on the wrong horse. His team has never prioritized public health and is actively pushing against the kind of regulations and incentives that he'll need to make the changes that he wants. Considering the influence, connections, and deep pockets of many of the people involved in Project 2025, it's going to be very hard for the new kid on the ticket to make a change. One factor we haven't covered yet is Trump himself. I think pundits get into a trap talking about Trump and RFK because they try to read statements from Trump himself and his close allies and his team like they're statements of belief or intent, which they're not. Trump's transition co-chair said they absolutely weren't going to bring on Project 2025 contributors, then they did. He said they absolutely weren't going to nominate RFK Jr. to head the HHS. Then they did. He said he'd give free rein to RFK to do whatever he wanted, then told interviewers RFK would be moderate. When trying to parse through Trump's statements, I find it helpful to assume three things. The first is that Trump is not the wellness guy, and it's a little weird and culty when you read comments that pretend that he is. Trump is the fast food president, a man who thinks exercise leads to early death. Wellness is not his thing. The second is that Trump's public statements indicate what he thinks will appeal to an audience, not necessarily what he thinks is true. Like a pro wrestler who knows that he's throwing the next match, he still commits to the bit and swears that he's in it to win. And third, Trump has interests, not ideas. He wants wealth, power, and influence, and he gets it by maintaining his personal brand, surrounding himself with the right people, and by giving his key players and voting blocs just enough support that they'll do the work that he wants them to do. He doesn't care what you want. He only cares that you're loyal. Obviously, I'm not a fan, but to an extent, this is just politics at its most brutal and amoral. Having ideological commitments makes you less flexible in power negotiations, and you need power to get the things that you want. For some politicians, this means compromising on their ideals in order to hopefully do a greater good down the line, which can feel sleazy and exhausting. Or you can just be like Trump, not have any ideals, and play the game like a no-limits any percent speedrun. Rules and integrity of the play be damned. With this in mind, I ignore all of Trump's public statements and focus on what his key players want, which we've already talked about, and his actions, the things he has already done that demonstrates who he supports and who supports him. So let's ask, what did the Trump administration actually do about wellness and about the things that RFK wants for wellness during his first term? Because the answer is not much. In RFK's terms, he repealed labeling requirements on GMOs, he started a trade war which cost farmers a lot of money and then paid an unprecedented billions of dollars in direct aid to make up for that. He relaxed Obama-era school nutrition standards, allowing, for instance, potato products like French fries to substitute for some fruit. He halved the fruit requirement for breakfast and allowed it to be substituted by sweet pastries and granola bars, waived the need for whole grains, and allowed schools to substitute a la carte items like pizza or burgers for the main meals that have to meet the higher standards. And as probably the best example of how the administration worked, they stalled a ban on the pesticide chlorpyrifos. I think I pronounced that right. Chlorpyrifos was the most common crop pesticide in the United States, but had been suspect for decades for a possible connection to developmental disabilities in children. It was banned in the EU, banned for home use in the US since 2001, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, among other groups, sued in 2007 for the EPA to make a judgment. The evidence kept growing, and in 2015, the Obama administration proposed a rule that would effectively ban it for use in crops. And despite a statement from the EPA scientists that chlorpyrifos was dangerous to humans, Scott Pruitt, Trump's EPA director, pulled a 180 and forced a stall until the courts, and then finally the Biden administration, pushed the ban through in 2021. The fact that Dow Chemicals, the manufacturer of chlorpyrifos, donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration, spent over $5 million total in lobbying in the first quarter of 2017, and that its CEO was on the President's American Manufacturing Council, may have had something to do with that decision. Maybe. In the words of Eric Lipton at Yale E360,
if President Trump had not been elected, that pesticide would almost certainly now be off the market. Instead, the spraying continues, as do the cases of workers falling ill and reports of child respiratory complications, developmental disorders, and lower IQs. It is a choice the Trump-era EPA has made.
And chlorpyrifos isn't the only one. N-methylpyridolidone? NMP. Trichloroethylene, or TCE, and methylene chloride all contributed to known deaths and were marked for regulation in an Obama EPA, and were taken off the chopping block. These are the kind of things RFK and his fans claim to be fighting for: our children, product transparency, healthier soils and farmland, more nutritious food for our kids, regulations of corporate profits when they come at the expense of American health. That's not what Trump's administration fought for. There's one other thing to consider about Trump's interests: his personal brand and market appeal. RFK was brought on board because it brought value to the campaign in a close race, and he still has value. He's dynamic and energetic. He appeals to a different demographic and pursues a new agenda, so the crunchy granola moms and podcast bros can point to RFK as our man on the inside and not feel bad about publicly supporting mass deportation, mass surveillance of and restrictions on women's healthcare, trade wars, and the openly racist elements of the Republican Party, along with everything else. But he can't appear to be opposed to Trump's agenda. He can't upstage him on his own show. So, to borrow a wrestling term, RFK had to turn heel. When the NRDC was suing the government to ban chlorpyrifos, RFK Jr. was in the NRDC as an attorney. He was there. He watched Trump's administration stall all of their work and roll back more than 100 environmental rules meant to guarantee clean air, water, protect wildlife. He criticized all of it. So he can't just change his mind. He has to explain his move in a way that appeals to his supporters. And that explanation is apparently that he and Trump actually agree on most things. Trump was just unprepared on his first term, misled by his advisors, and it will be different this time.
In 2016 to 2020, I fought everything he did. He appointed people to, he appointed an oil industry lobbyist, Ryan Zinke, to run Interior Department, a coal industry lobbyist to run the EPA, a pharmaceutical industry lobbyist to run the Health and Human Services. He said to me when we met, he said, the last time I came into office in 2016, I had no idea how to govern. And he said, I was surrounded by business people and lobbyists who said, you got to appoint this guy, this guy, this guy. And he said, I listened to him and I did it. He said they were a bunch of bad people. And he said, we're not going to do that this time. We're going to do something different. And
so, despite appealing to the Harris administration for a position, and despite the Democrats actually trying to do many of the things that he wants, he parroted the talking points he was supposed to on the campaign trail. And he's going to have to keep it up, or else. We saw this when RFK criticized the junk food eaten by the Trump team. A week after that criticism, RFK was caught like a deer in the headlights by a Trump team photographer eating McDonald's and drinking Coke.
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation.
Don Jr. released it on his personal Instagram with the caption, "Make America Healthy Again starts tomorrow." And many of RFK Jr.'s fans responded with disgust and betrayal. After all, this is the same pure evil, synthetic, unnatural, chemical McDonald's food that the food babe was talking about at RFK's roundtable.
In the US, there's 11 ingredients. In the UK, there's 3, and salt is optional. An ingredient called dimethylpolysiloxane is an ingredient preserved with formaldehyde, a neurotoxin, in the US version. This is used as a foaming agent so they don't have to replace the oil that often, making McDonald's more money.
And some fans tried to justify it as a stage shot. RFK would never eat like that, only to have Don Jr. cut off that excuse at the knees.
In the mob, there's this thing, if you think someone is an informant, you make them take a little drugs. So I have to say, put 19 up on screen here. Don, you got to explain to me how you got Bobby Kennedy can we get 19 up on screen? How you got Bobby Kennedy to eat McDonald's? He looks less than thrilled, by the way, at this 2 a.m. fast food initiation.
Yeah.
So Don, what's going on here?
Bobby did have some McDonald's. We definitely had some fun with that one. The memes about it. I mean, yeah, he definitely looks like he got his hand caught in the cookie jar.
I recognize that this is a bit of a reach, but I can't help but feel like this was somewhere between hazing and a warning shot. Lighthearted, sure, but clear. You don't get to judge us publicly. You don't get your own agenda. You're only here because we let you be here. And that's one thing Bobby's fans forget. As an appointed position, Trump can fire him at any moment, and Trump has demonstrated that he will fire cabinet members in a heartbeat. In his first term, Trump's turnover for his closest staff was almost 92%, Out of his A-team, most didn't make it through all 4 years. And Trump fired more of his senior staff and cabinet level appointees than any other president in recent history. Trump and his most powerful key supporters have a very different agenda from RFK. He's still useful, for now, but Trump doesn't need him. And if he tries to pursue his own agenda, tries to make his own brand under the Trump banner, Maha? Gone. Poof. And the day that it happens, Trump isn't going to take up the torch for healthy living. He'll humiliate RFK just like he's done all of his ex-allies. One day, they're the greatest person on earth.
John Kelly, who has done an incredible job of Secretary of Homeland Security. Incredible. One of our real stars. Truly one of our stars.
The next, they're getting booed and threatened at his rallies. So, what is RFK's agenda? Let's take a look at his statements and his years of activism, the things he personally seems to believe and want. As a very public figure with a long history, there's inevitably more than one RFK Jr. There's RFK Jr., head of the Children's Health Defense Fund. There's RFK Jr., wellness influencer. RFK Jr., environmentalist and lawyer. RFK Jr., COVID anti-vaccine freedom fighter. And RFK Jr., nominee to run the Department of Health and Human Services. As we look at these, I'm not going to pretend he is not a crank. If you're on board with every wild thing he's said, not just in his life, just the last couple of years, you probably gave up watching this video a long time ago. He claims not to be an anti-vaxxer, but get him in front of a sympathetic audience and he'll claim that no vaccines are safe, effective, and tested.
Difficult question. Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
He has spread the lie that vaccines cause autism, that outbreaks of deadly viruses are caused by the vaccine, and to a level that approaches creepy old man, discourages people from vaccinating their kids.
Our job is to resist and to talk about it to everybody. If you're walking down the street, and I do this now myself, which is, I don't want to do, I'm not a busybody. I see somebody on a hiking trail carrying a little baby, and I say to him, better not get him vaccinated. And he heard that from me. If he hears it from 10 other people, maybe he won't do it. Maybe he will save that child.
During COVID, he spread the Great Reset conspiracy that the virus was manufactured and being used to give the globalist elites power over the populace. He said that the virus was tailored to attack Caucasian and Black people and not Jewish and Chinese people, and that Big Pharma was suppressing the effectiveness of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, two initially promising drugs that just didn't pan out, to warp speed the release of the COVID vaccine. He's convinced that the CIA killed JFK, that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, that we should be looking at the herbicide atrazine for its possible connections to gender dysphoria. If that one sounds out of the blue, it's the drug that inspired this famous meme.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
He's suggested that 5G cellular networks cause cancer, open your blood-brain barrier, and expose you to control through your wireless devices. That fluoridation of public water causes disease, that mass shootings are caused by antidepressants, that voter fraud stole the 2004 election from John Kerry, and that his father's assassin was hypnotized into doing it? There's the fact that a worm ate part of his brain, and then there was the time that he compared COVID lockdowns to the Holocaust.
Even in Hitler's Germany, you could cross the Alps into Switzerland. You can hide in an attic like Anne Frank did.
Something even his wife couldn't stand for and that he had to apologize for. And then, of course, there's the New York City Bear episode. I'm not trying to do a point-for-point debunking on specific topics. For that, check out Derek Barris at Conspirituality, Dr. Andrea Love, Dr. David Gorski, Tim Caulfield, and I seriously mean that. Go check them out. I'll put their details in the description. But it's important to remember that when we start talking about more apparently clear-headed policies on things that we can disagree on fairly, like conflicts of interest and drug approvals, or what the researchers at the National Institutes of Health should focus on, this is the figure who needs to be clear-headed enough to make right judgments. Now that we know who the players in the game are and what they want, we can bring it all together and see what Bobby, possible head of the HHS, has said that Maha can and should do. These are the filtered positions, the ones that he's carefully considered and put out to the public after he endorsed Trump, after he had made this full calculus of the considerations. And he provided us a convenient list in the form of an editorial in the Wall Street Journal before Trump won the election. I'm going to categorize these in 4 buckets. There's the possibly good ideas with caveats, grifts, bad ideas, and hard to win battles that may or may not even be worthwhile, but we'll see. Let's start with the maybe good ideas. He suggests reviewing direct-to-consumer pharma ads, pointing out that only the US and New Zealand allow these. There are arguments for and against these bans. I personally lean in favor of a ban. But note his reason why. Not because it misleads customers, hamstrings doctors, hurts public health, but because advertiser dollars bias news organizations. This might just be a way to reframe the policy so that the Medical Freedom Party, his own base, doesn't shoot it down. But it also mirrors the language and motives presented in Project 2025 so closely, I have to wonder if they're playing off the same sheet of music. RFK Jr. wants to reform the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. This act was started in 1992 because the FDA was underfunded, and it was taking about 2.5 years to get drugs through approval. We need a rigorous approval process to make sure that drugs are safe and effective. But this slow process was bad for everyone. It raised costs, delayed innovation, and in the case of the AIDS epidemic, was leaving people to die while effective drugs were working their way through the system. So the act was a compromise. Drug companies would pay fees that would allow the drug approval divisions to hire staff that they needed to then expedite approvals. And the FDA guaranteed quicker turnarounds. However, the demand for new drugs and failures to fund the FDA appropriately meant that fees ballooned until in 2020 they make up 45% of the FDA's total program level. This causes worry for good reason. If the regulator is receiving half of its funding from the industry that it's regulating, that doesn't inspire public trust in the process. So reform makes sense. Just where is the money going to come from? And who should pay for these trials if not the companies themselves? Next, RFK Jr. wants to restrict SNAP from covering soda and other ultra-processed foods. SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, is a program for low-income Americans to be able to afford extra food. It's not a lot, a little under $200 a month per individual, and there's already restrictions on what you can and can't get with it and where you can and can't get things with it. Banning ultra-processed foods here is complicated, because how do you define processed? And once that's defined, do people on SNAP have access to the unprocessed foods they'd be allowed to buy? If you get this one wrong, you're not helping people get healthier foods, you're just denying people access to their benefits. On the other hand, why should Coca-Cola get massive amounts of taxpayer dollars to sell sugar-sweetened beverages, one of the largest sources of excess calories and sugars in the diet, a food that we know pushes out other nutritious options, and then get to use that money to pay lawmakers so that they can keep receiving taxpayer money? Finally, RFK wants to prohibit anyone on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee and any scientist receiving funds from the NIH from having conflicts of interest with food or drug manufacturers. This one sounds good, but as I pointed out in my video on the dietary guidelines, research funding for the NIH has shrunk dramatically, so researchers have had to get funds from industry. And despite the conflicts of interest, the guidelines are actually pretty good. If you're getting ready to type an angry comment right now, go watch my other video on that first. Thanks. To fix this, RFK Jr. would need to dramatically raise funding for the NIH, which his party desperately resists because they distrust science in general, or cut research dramatically, which he says he doesn't want to do. Or he could rely on lower quality, lower cost studies run by smaller labs with funding from other sources, like wellness companies, special interest groups, think tanks. And what conclusions do you think these scientists are likely to come to? Then let's move on to the grifts. The first is expanding access to health savings accounts for every American. This is why I introduced Callie in advance, because this initially sounds good if you don't see the players. The real goal isn't to help cash-strapped Americans in a broken healthcare system. It's to funnel tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars through companies like TrueMed for home gym equipment from Nike. It's not a solution that can scale. It will drive up the prices of these goods. It'll primarily go to the businesses that are large enough or connected enough to afford a middleman like TrueMed, and it drains taxpayer funds from public health solutions that can actually work. The next is to require nutrition classes and functional medicine in federally funded medical schools. Just like the HSA, this sounds fine, but general nutrition education isn't a solution to any problem I'm going to a doctor for. And specific nutrition education, things like how to appropriately use iron supplements in the diagnosis and treatment of anemia, is either already covered or needs to be treated by a specialist who can spend the time to get it right. And functional medicine is just a handout to Dr. Hyman for an ineffective and wasteful approach to treatment that, even at its best, is too expensive to address public health issues at scale. Then there are bad ideas. The first is devoting half of research budgets from the NIH towards preventative, alternative, and holistic approaches to health. This is part grift. Dr. Hyman and Dr. Means would both really appreciate these research grants, especially if there's someone at the top who can gently put their finger on the scale, but it's also just wasteful. Many of these alternative and holistic approaches aren't being suppressed. They just produce underwhelming or negative initial results. Forcing money towards them when they're already failing is an act of faith, not science. And it's not like infectious diseases, acute treatments, and conditions like Alzheimer's aren't still a problem. RFK has said that he wants to revisit pesticide and other chemical use standards for things like dyes and additives and preservatives, using the EU as a standard. If it's banned in the EU, why should we allow it for our citizens? I've already pointed out that the previous Trump administration blocked this same effort. It's also not in the Republican spirit to tell someone with a lot of money no if they can get some of that money. More importantly though, RFK has demonstrated he doesn't rationally evaluate these standards. Many of the ones that he has personally railed about are allowed in the EU, just they use a different name. And the organic pesticides that he prefers are often more toxic and need higher doses in order to get the job done. And then there are the hard to win battles. Like, he wants to push for legislators to fight for drug price caps so that pharmaceutical companies can't charge Americans more than Europeans. I like it, but note that he pushes it off onto Congress so he doesn't have to take the blame when that doesn't happen. To do it the way that Germany does it, the way RFK says it should be done, we need something closer to a single-payer healthcare system, which his party has been calling socialism for decades now. And as of time of recording, a Republican-led Congress is trying to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes exactly what RFK is talking about: a cap on insulin prices, and authorizing Medicare to negotiate with drug companies for lower prices. He says he wants to reform crop subsidies. As we've discussed before, he's going to be fighting an uphill battle on that one, especially when it comes to trying to encourage vegetables and fruits and organic or regenerative agriculture. I'll add one last item that wasn't explicitly in this editorial, and that was getting processed foods out of school lunches.
If you're given a position by the Trump administration in the agricultural department, what will you do to improve school lunches?
I'll get processed food out of school lunch immediately. About half the school lunch program goes to processed food.
In theory, I'm all for this. This would be a big win. But when Michelle Obama tried to do this, industry and the Republican Party fought viciously, and the Trump administration peeled back those wins as soon as they could. Now, Republicans are fully capable of hypocrisy, supporting RFK today for what they demonized Michelle for 10 years ago. But there is so much lobbying in the packaged foods industry and so many departments involved that I don't see this going anywhere. So, at best, it's a mixed bag. The crankiest items aren't even on his list, so it won't make the Maha moms happy, but he might try to squeeze some of those through more quietly through executive and administrative actions when he's in office. Some he won't be in a position to change or have the power to change. Some are like brazen handouts to his friends. And there are a few that might be steps in the right direction, but they would need to be fought for, funded properly, and administered by someone with a clear head and a focus on clear, objective science. There's one last item I want to point out. He wants to reinstitute presidential fitness test standards. This is a point back to JFK, who piloted the test during his presidency. Let's revisit JFK for a moment. RFK isn't the first person to try to reform American health. Hell, he's not even the first Kennedy. So, what did we learn from them? JFK had a personal conviction about the importance of health and fitness. He didn't have a history of crank ideas weighing him down, and he had the presidency. And arguably, he failed. Obesity and some chronic diseases continue to rise. The President's Council started out strong, but today, have you heard of their headline programs like the National Youth Sports Strategy or Fitnessgram? I'm a strength coach. I like nerding out on things like the long-term athletic development model, and I hadn't heard about it. Unless you're directly involved in school athletics, you probably haven't either. And then there were fitness programs that Kennedy endorsed, like those at La Sierra High School, which collapsed under pressure from all sides without his support. Even before Kennedy, there was intense resistance to the idea of national fitness standards and mandatory group exercise for children. It looked too similar to the National Fitness Program of the USSR, making it communist and un-American. Add public sentiment against the Vietnam War, and anything that looked like military indoctrination got scrapped. But it wasn't just softies on the left. Warhawks on the right were concerned that prioritizing PE was too holistic, and America's future depended on hard science, not hard muscles. So when the National Defense Education Act was amended in 1964, PE wasn't even mentioned. And more pressures mounted at the state and local level. Initially, women weren't included in these programs, but with the passage of Title IX in 1972, we had co-ed integration. And a backlash. Despite some supporting science and the experience of women in these programs, some administrators, physical therapists, and parents started to replace them with lighter alternatives rather than subject their fragile girls to obstacle courses, gymnastics, and weightlifting. There were also funding constraints. Although per capita spending on education has gone up over the last 60 years, so have the demands that schools are expected to meet. And most funding is provided by local and state tax revenues, so cash-strapped districts had to cut corners to meet budgets. And all of this was happening as American interests were shifting from public to private solutions for health. It's hard to pin down culture, but Kennedy's presidency in the decades to follow marked the mainstreaming of wellness, a boom in yoga studios, gyms, group exercise programs, VHS tapes. At universities, exercise science and kinesiology degree programs grew and pushed out physical education departments. Being a personal trainer or sport coach was, in my opinion very wrongly, seen as more prestigious and high skill than PE. So, despite JFK's best efforts, what we're left with is a symbolic gesture, the 50-mile march. After doing it, and doing other long endurance events like it, there's something almost symbolic, almost emblematic of the kind of work that it takes to move the needle for these big problems. It's not flashy. It's not a big program. It's not one dye or seed oils. It is a steady, disciplined grind. There's no one sprint where everyone is going to cheer you on for making the right choice. You're at mile 15 and your hip starts to get grumpy. And it's going to let you finish. You can push through. But you're going to work through that pain for the next 35 miles. Your ankle, your feet, everything just starts weighing you down, and all you can do is pay attention to your body, stick with the goal, and keep trucking, keep fighting. There's something nostalgic, the idea that, oh, we had it. It was one of these big solutions and we just fumbled the ball at the finish line. I don't think so. Here's where I take off my evidence hat and make a prediction. At best, he'll get some of the more promising and beneficial policies through, along with some of the grift. Some of these changes will have the desired effect. Some will get drowned in bureaucracy. Some will lead to unintended negative consequences. And some, it'll be impossible to measure the effect. At worst, he could get some of his crankiest positions endorsed by law. And operating within the establishment, he could gum up efforts to rein in infectious disease or develop new vaccines. He can set the standard for proving something is safe and effective so unreasonably high that no vaccine can meet it. He could defund the Vaccine for Children's program or just throw the match when Del Bigtree and Aaron Siri sue the government to change policy, all while claiming to be on the side of science. His presence in office, with his history, could lead others to do the same. We're already seeing this with health professionals in Louisiana reporting they're quietly being restricted from encouraging vaccines. He could put his thumb on the scales of research, wasting tax dollars on failed projects, and he could smother our ability to accurately understand the impact of these changes. That wouldn't even be a new practice. It's the same playbook Republicans have applied to gun violence nationally and to maternal health in states where they've restricted abortion access. If there's any fear that the data won't favor them, they hamstring government agencies from collecting accurate information. He could allow agency budgets to shrink, reducing the resources that they need to do good work. Maha moms like to point to drugs like thalidomide as an example of big pharma pushing medication that hurts women and babies. But they forget that thalidomide wasn't a problem in the US because a doctor at the FDA, a woman named Frances Oldham Kelsey, refused to approve thalidomide because it didn't meet the FDA's standards. Organizations like the FDA have done wonders for our health and safety, and a man who threatens to cut, burn, and slash staff once he's appointed, someone who sees the FDA as irreparably broken, may not be the right person to keep those wonders coming. And I don't know if you could call this worse, but it might be worse if these all are distractions from other objectives proposed in Project 2025. So Republicans want to reduce access to SNAP and WIC. They want to reduce or eliminate all trans healthcare and the recognition of trans people at all. And these goals have real-world impacts. Earlier this year, Providence St. Joseph Hospital was sued for denying emergency care to a woman who experienced a miscarriage. Allegedly, they offered her a $40,000 helicopter ride at her expense. And a doctor at the hospital told her that if she tried to drive where they recommended, she would die before she made it. The pregnancy was non-viable. They knew her life was in immediate danger, and they refused to provide care for religious reasons. Luckily, she was seen at a clinic close by. But that clinic was closing down. If something similar had happened just a month later, she would not have had that opportunity. And Kennedy's party wants to expand religious exemptions for critical care as a First Amendment right. In a conservative future, not only might she not have received care, but her family wouldn't even be able to sue. My bet? Closer to the mixed bag, a little bit towards the worst side. He'll get some of those popular stroke of the pen initiatives through and some agenda items that already have the backing of the Republican coalition. He'll fight to push transformational change. I think he seriously believes in it. But where his agenda conflicts with conservative, corporate, or Trump's agenda, he'll lose more often than he wins. Some of his crankiest ideas will influence the agency and American health, but they're not popular, so he won't be able to push them too hard. Business will continue as usual, just worse. Possibly a lot worse. And no one will be happy. Not scientists, not the Maha moms, not the public, until he either gets fired by Trump, replaced by the next administration, or passes away, and his legacy becomes a muddled mess. Either way, no one wins, no one's happy, and Americans aren't healthier. By this point, it should come as no surprise that I'm no fan of Kennedy, Trump, or the Republican Party. In my research for this, though, I saw hundreds, thousands of people posting and sharing how inspired they are by him, how the Kennedy-Trump team were God sent to change everything. And having only seen Kennedy's COVID arc, I just couldn't see it. To me, he was just another charismatic health crank, a cross between Dr. Oz and Tony Robbins. And that is just, no. But then I found an audio clip from a presentation he gave in 2011, when he was still doing legal work for environmental causes.
Once you build that oil plant, now you got to go to Saudi Arabia, punch holes in the ground, bring up the oil, refine it expensively, genuflect to the sheiks who despise democracy and are hated by their own people, get in periodic wars that cost us $3 trillion, escorted across the Atlantic with a military escort that Exxon doesn't pay for, you and I do. Then you spill it all over the Gulf, spill it all over Valdez, burn the oil, and poison everybody in our country. And so the big costs occur after you build the plant.
After listening to his presentation, I got it. If you listen to the whole thing, you can hear his passion, his excitement, and what seems to be an incredible memory. He cites an endless string of studies, statistics, quotes, has personal anecdotes. When I hear him fighting for a cause I care about, I got caught up in that same feeling for a moment, that this man is in the arena. He's got the big picture, the vision. He just needs the power to make it happen. But even back then, before the vaccines and red dye number 40, his charisma was a liability, not a solution. The Indian Point Power Center, a nuclear plant near New York City, had long been a battleground for environmentalists. And RFK's sister, Rory Kennedy, was directing a documentary to highlight the risks of a 9/11 style attack on the facility. RFK Jr. was scheduled for an interview as part of it. As a popular, charismatic environmentalist and a Kennedy, the studio thought he would be a great addition. According to an article in Vanity Fair, though, his sister was cautious.
He can say some crazy shit, she told them, according to a person involved in the film. Kennedy's interviews had to be thoroughly fact-checked, even though he might come across as an expert, she said. That's who he is.
In reviewing his interviews for the film, despite how convincing and confident he'd sounded, producers found he'd littered his sections with so many inflated and inaccurate claims that they had to cut his sections dramatically or risk a lawsuit. And his efforts may have hurt the causes he cared about most. The war against the plant waged for years, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, until political pressure in 2015 forced its closure. And the power it generated was replaced by fossil fuels, the biggest enemy of RFK's professional career. If you're a Kennedy fan or a Maha mom, I get it. I really do. There are real problems, and it's exciting to get behind a guy who's doing something. But it's not enough to have power. You have to work with the right team. And MAGA is not that team. And you have to have an accurate picture of the real problems and their causes, or you might end up even worse than you started. And RFK doesn't have that picture. But whether you're a Kennedy stan or not, you don't have to rely on his judgment. Stay informed. Recognize the interests hidden behind these agenda items, because often they're not for you. They're for Cali Means. And to those who are more on the never Kennedy side of things, please don't fall for the reflexive trap of rejecting everything that sounds Kennedy adjacent. Multinational food companies and corrupt drug companies are still pushing products and policies that lead to the early deaths of millions, and it's okay to agree on that. And to whatever extent you can, be the kind of champion that I think everyone wants Kennedy to be. Get involved at whatever level you can, improving people's health and security. That might mean running for office and taking up the cause yourself, or donating to journalists and scientists who are fighting that fight. Or it might mean serving your community, your family in small ways. Support your high school sports team. Donate food to your local food bank. Keep your family up to date on vaccines. Don't waste money on worthless and expensive supplements. Get necessary checkups, stay active, eat wholesome food, floss your teeth. We can take individual action at every level to improve our health. And we don't need Maha to make that happen. Ahoy! Thanks for making it to the end of the video. I had originally actually wanted to take a little bit longer with this, to wait until RFK's nomination had been confirmed and we got to see some of these conflicts between MAGA and Maha. But we're already seeing things moving so fast. The complete blackout of communication from all of the health organizations federally, the lockout of NIH funds for research projects, even those that are ongoing, even the ones that fit the complementary alternative or preventative health objectives that RFK wants. There are already so many of these pieces moving that I just couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't possibly thank every scientist, journalist, science communicator who informed or inspired some of this, but I would like to highlight a few. The first is Dr. Andrea Love. If you weren't a chemistry guy in college, some of this can get really difficult to parse through, like red dye 3 verse 40, or Cali Means dropped some crank claim about cancer on Twitter. And she does a fantastic job of breaking down the specific claims in a way that's accessible. The next is Professor Tim Caulfield, not just for like specific claims or issues about anti-vaccine advocacy or RFK, but the general topic of misinformation and disinformation. How do you stay informed with this flood that is trying to misinform you? And I found his feed and just his work in general to be really helpful with that. And finally, Derek Barris, in particular, like he focuses on, or he deals a lot with the things that are involved in Maha, but the whole conspirituality team. So Matthew Remski and Julian Walker as well. The three of them, they wrote a book, they run a podcast, A Conspirituality and the Conspirituality Podcast. And what I love about their work isn't just the specific debunking or claims, but how they do the work, the analysis, to put it in context, in a social context, a historical context, and connect these disparate figures and show, no, this is how they operate. This is what they're doing. Conspirituality has been a top 3 podcast of mine for years. I absolutely recommend listening. And finally, I don't have any sponsors. Nobody's paying me for this, but this has been the most complicated project in terms of research of any of the ones that I've done. Not in terms of number of sources, but pulling from all different places, social media, podcasts, interviews, and finding a way to connect them and make them searchable and shareable, because I do want to share them in the description. Wouldn't have been possible without Thomas Frank's ultimate brain. So Ultimate Brain is a Notion template that serves as kind of a second brain and makes sources across projects, because a lot of this pulled from previous videos or things that I've done from work, and makes them linkable and useful in a way that I just couldn't have really gotten this done, definitely not this quickly, without it. As well, and paired with that, his Flylighter app, which is a Chrome web extension, being able to just, boom, I need this, I don't have time to look at it now, click, boom, pull it into my research, and then process it later, was a game changer. All in all, again, thank you for staying through to the end of the video. My biggest hope is that you, me, we collectively find a way to stay as healthy as we can in these times. I don't think Maha is going to work. I think it's already failing. But we don't need Maha. And I'd rather us, instead of focusing on make America healthy again, focusing on make our communities, our families healthy today. So, thank you so much, and I'll see you around.